This is Jeffrey Madoff, and welcome to our podcast called Anything and Everything with my partner, Dan Sullivan.
It's Sunday, and on Sunday, the podcast Anything and Everything takes place. You're actually experiencing something that happens on Sundays, not just in Manhattan, but also in Toronto. That's where it happens. Jeff, we were talking a couple of weeks ago, and I think it was a book from the 1990s called The Experience Economy. And I was very interested at the time. I read the book, and I thought it made very important distinction about business in the marketplace, which is usually people talk about products, they talk about services, and usually they talk about them as a commodity. And one of the things that I always felt that something that is a commodity that everybody loves more than another commodity, it isn't because of the price, it's because of the experience. That there's an experience that people have with certain products, certain services that goes way, way above price comparison. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that it is a true statement that people buy things, and what continues to cause them to buy those things, aside from obviously basic necessities. I have experience with toilet paper, but it's not necessarily something that I would say is part of the experience economy, but that's a commodity that I buy. But in terms of so many things, how you feel as a result of that transaction and that purchase leaves a tremendous impact. And that impact is essential if you are trying to build a brand loyalty. And that can be H&R Block selling a tax service, or that can be Ralph Lauren selling the kind of articles of clothing and furniture and housewares that create the movie scenes that are the life that Ralph has created for the people that buy his goods. And all of those different things can make you feel good and cement that experience so you go back. Mm-hmm. But how would you explain even the term experience economy?
Well, first of all, I'd like to back it up a little bit. And I said, I think everybody, when they buy anything, they're buying an experience that's a future experience. And what I mean is, a luxury car, a Mercedes. Let's use a Mercedes as an example. I think that what people are actually buying is being seen driving around in the Mercedes. I don't think they're actually buying the Mercedes. That they have a series of scenarios in the future that they're going to drive up in a Mercedes. Okay. And what the experience is, I'm not quite sure. The experience is that they felt badly about the car that they have when they drive to a certain place and everyone else has a luxury car. And so this brings them up in class. I think status has a lot to do with the experience. I think you're buying a certain confirmation of status when you buy a particular, product or a service. And my sense is that the person's mind, when they're buying anything in the present, they actually have a future context for what this means.
Well, I think that's true. And, your comment about the car, the Mercedes, which is a great example, reminds me of, I was shopping and a good friend of mine was with me, and we went to Zabar's, which has a great housewares department. I needed a tea kettle, and they must have had 40 of them, ranging in price from $19.95 up to $400. And I'm looking at all these things, and Doug Fielding, my friend, says to me, they all hold boiling water. Mm-hmm. So which one do you like? And the funny thing is, a car is about getting you from here to there, unless you're on the highways a lot, which most people aren't. Why are you buying it? And I think that you're right. There's an associative memory of some sort with that and the status that accompanies that kind of thing. That really stuck with me when he said they'll all hold boiling water. Really, what do you want a tea kettle for? But that,
yeah,
and I think that's true with a whole lot of things in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that would tell me that isn't his particular experience.
How do you mean?
that it's strictly the utility of the product that he's zeroed in on. But
Yes.
if you ask your friend some other experience, he would have an equivalent, that there's a particular type of product that gives him a particular type of experience. I don't know what it is, and I'm sure we don't know the full range of what other people find as valuable. I'll give you an example. It's a really interesting one. There's a great hotel in Santa Monica right on the beach. It's the only hotel along there. First of all, it's a luxury. It's called Shutters.
Shutters. I've been there a few times.
And it's just a really, really neat hotel. It just got a nice feel to it. And whenever we do our workshops about 500 feet from Shutters, it goes up a hill and there's the main street there, Ocean Avenue. The hotel there is where we do our strategic coach workshops in Santa Monica, have been since 1998, I think. We stay there and the staff is fairly constant. But what they give you in every room, they give you Swedish boxes. It's called Zundis. And they're really nice. They're actually pipe matches. They're not, normal matches. And who smokes these days? But they always give you matches, and it's a little Zundis. And you can't buy them anywhere. Like we've tried over the years to buy them. So what I do is I'll talk to the concierge, and I says, I'd like to have a package of 10 Zundis matches when we leave here. And then there's an arrangement made, and the concierge gets tipped and everything else. And I get my 10 boxes of Zundis. And I have them everywhere. We have them in Chicago at our house. We have them here. We have them, everywhere we are. We have the Zundis. And what we've done is they're so hard to get that I'll buy other matches of the same size, take them out of that box, and I'll put them in the Zundis box. And I tell people this, and they says, Dan, you're really weird. You're really weird, like boxes of match. I said, I love Zundis, but I think it probably conveys my experience of being at that hotel. And when we're not there, we have some of the experience of that hotel where we are. Because every time we pick up the box here, I think of Shutters.
Yeah. And I think one of the things with experiences in terms of experience economy is talking about how you experience that item and the memory that's associated with it. Mm-hmm. To some people, they would see it as a box of matches. Mm-hmm. But to you, it triggers a certain memory of how you were treated, the place that you really like. And those memories in the experience economy, one would argue that what they're really selling you is the memory. The product is the memory that you get. Mm-hmm. Pine and Gilmore, who wrote the experience economy, that's what they talk about. Mm-hmm. And, that's the whole notion of souvenirs, right? Yeah. As a result of your travel, that's one of your souvenirs. Every time you go there, you get those matches. Mm-hmm. You probably don't even use the matches up. You and Babs don't smoke. I don't know how many people smoke to come into your house.
They're really handy in bathrooms.
Okay. A different kind of experience, but
yeah, there's a wide variety of different kinds of experiences. Yeah, and we have lots of candles around, at nighttime when we have dinner parties, little lights.
Votives?
Yeah, sort of, yeah. And the other thing is, for at least 30 years, when I get trousers, they always have pleats and they always have cuffs, which is 1940s, really. It's basically 1940s. But I thought the 1940s, late 1930s, 1940s, is probably the most stylish period of menswear in history. I think that it was like the golden age for menswear. Cary Grant, and they had pleats and they have cuffs. And everybody says, it's so weird that you have pleats. And I said, yeah, I like them. It reminds me of the 1940s.
Well, so what is it that makes something memorable?
I mean, it happened, when you were younger. So I think we like to integrate our lives. When we're 20 or 30 years beyond, we like something that connects us back to when we were a younger age.
I mean, there's a comfort.
There's a sense of congruity that you haven't changed that much. I mean, we're all required to change lots of things as the times change, as the environment changes, but there's certain things I really like hanging on to from my earlier days.
I mean, it's funny when you see somebody as they get older, and like when I went to my 50th high school reunion in Akron. And I saw people that, this was more true with women because most of the men had lost their hair, but there were those that still had the same hairdo they had in high school. You know, can't say that it looked great anymore, but that gave them a certain comfort and consistency, I guess, in their lives. And so they associate that style, you know, with pleasant memories or good memories or something like that. And so the experience economy becomes about creating those unique memories. And I always wondered about it because, you know, another area of these memories is trauma. And you can remember some traumatic circumstances wipe out memory, but other circumstances remind one of the trauma. And as a result, they're very uncomfortable doing X that somehow triggers that response, that trauma response. But that's a memory too. And that was something that was memorable.
It's very interesting. I've had a series of orthopedic injuries. The first one was when I was 12 years old. It was an ankle break. And I had one few years later, it was broken arm. I've had broken Achilles tendons and everything like that. And every time you know, it was more or less an emergency visit to the hospital. You know, you were picked up by an ambulance and you were taken to the hospital. And in every case, I got extraordinarily good treatment and personal treatment from the medical staff, the doctors, the nurses, and everything else. So I've always had a really great positive attitude towards hospitals, where other people, it's a source of fear, you know.
Yeah, I remember feeling betrayed by the hospital because when I was a kid, when I was around 10, I had my tonsils out. And at that time, I guess they were offering a package deal. You'd get your tonsils and your adenoids, which I still don't know what the hell the adenoids do, but the adenoids would come out too. And I don't know if you got it where you grew up in Ohio, but do you remember Captain Penny?
Oh, sure. Everybody remembers Captain Penny, if you grew up in Ohio in the 1950s.
Yes, Ron Penfound. Remember, you can fool some of the people some of the time, and part of the people all of the time, but you can't fool mom. Anyhow, he talked about, you know, because I guess kids watching that were at the age where you'd be getting tonsillectomies, which they don't take out anymore, by the way. They realize it actually blocks certain kinds of infection. But anyhow, he talked about how, and when you get your tonsils out, you can have all the vanilla ice cream you want. And so I remember thinking about this when I was literally in the operating room and they were dripping ether on something that looked like a strainer covered with gauze.
Yeah.
And as I think back on it, it's like, what, I grew up during the Civil War? You know, bite this stick. We're going to take.
No, they were still using ether when I was growing up.
Yeah. And so anyhow,
they put it, you know, they had sort of a cup. They just put it over your nose and mouth. And
the smell was horrible, which reminded me of what the janitor's closet smelled like in school, the cleaning disinfectants that they had there, which that always got me. But what I found out was when I woke up, I said, could I have some vanilla ice cream? They said, oh, no, you can't have ice cream now. So what do you mean I can't have ice cream? You know, and they said,
this is the deal.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
And so they give you something that I've never understood why people like it, which is called Jell-O, you know.
Non-food.
Yes. And everybody has got the aunt that for a particular holiday occasion, when they're invited over, they bring their Jell-O with the canned fruit suspended in the Jell-O.
Oh, yeah.
Anyhow, I got ice cream like one time. I was in there for like 3 days. Probably you're in and out in the same day these days. Then I thought, wow, can't trust adults. You know, Captain Penny sold me this whole bill of goods. So at least the hospital experience wouldn't be bad. And they didn't live up to the contract.
Yeah, I was too when mine were taken out.
Really?
Yeah, and it was in Euclid. We lived in Rocky River, so west side to east side. And but it was a day of a great blizzard in Cleveland, and my mother dropped me off, and she had to go back and do something with the kids, my siblings, and then she was going to come back, but she couldn't come back. So I was left overnight and then went through the operation without my mother.
Mm.
She said that I was born a happy kid. She said, you were just very, very happy as a kid and, sort of self-entertaining and self-educating. I just, sort of took it upon myself to keep myself occupied and busy. But she said that she was really worried that I would be scared. And I came back and she said it was no difference. But the next time she took me to church, the nuns were there and I froze like this with the nuns. And the hospital was run by nuns. And I think somebody treated me meanly. And I remember that. And I always had this thing when you're around nuns. It isn't that I hate them, but you really got to be wary. You got to be wary around them. That you have to be on full alert. You got to be on full alert. You never know what one of those women in black are going to do.
Wasn't that Tommy Lee Jones? Oh, that was Men in Black, Tommy Lee Jones, not Women in Black.
Look at the pen.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. But I think it's a way of integrating our lives, like we've spoken a lot. I mean, it's probably one of the attractions of the podcast series to us because we have 70 years of memories that go back to more or less the same locale in the United States, and I think that we're constantly integrating present, past, and future. We're pulling things together. It has to make sense. I mean, we're meaning-making creatures. We have to create meaning out of our experience.
Although I think that's true, I've always...
You're going to disagree with me.
I think that's true, too.
Or you're going to add something that gives it more profound meaning. Greater depth.
It's what makes things memorable, what makes things stick. Yes, there's that commonality of experience and so on, and how we tend to, unbeknownst to ourselves, even rewrite our memories. And
that I'm convinced of. My feeling is someone who has a fixed memory has a fixed, that, in other words, everything happened exactly the way you think it happened. Yeah. You're just not learning.
That's right. That's right. And so how, I thought it was really interesting when I was reading Pine and Gilmore and the experience economy. I thought it was really interesting when they said that memory becomes the product. And a friend of mine has a quote, and he says, yeah, that made a lot of sense until I thought about it. And I don't think that, the memory isn't the product, but the memory is a byproduct that makes something memorable. And I think that there's a difference. Yeah,
well, I think the thing is that I don't think that saying the memory is the product is commoditizing the memory. Okay, it's commoditizing. I think the memory is an experience. Okay, and I think an experience surpasses a commodity.
Oh, I agree. I agree. The nature of commodities are, you can buy, most things are commoditized, and it's those that are unique and aware enough to build a brand and a brand experience around it that differentiates and can command premium pricing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the case. But there are so many things outside of business. There are so many things that we do to preserve memory. Because something was memorable. It was somehow had an impact on our lives.
Well, it had great meaning.
Yes. Yeah. So, do you have an example? Like, I guess you're talking.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking we've just purchased more land up north where our cottage is, and it's got a It's got about a 5-acre woods. It's on a big hill, but it's just, it's just pure, natural woods. There's nothing in it. And I grew up on a farm that we had woods at the back of the farm. And that was a great treat when I was 6 years old. I got the right to go into the woods on my own. I could go down there and play. And I turned it into Robin Hood's forest. And, you had all these other things. There were various, I had read, the comic book story of Robin Hood, and then I transposed the story into the woods and everything like that. And throughout the years, I've always said, someday I'd like to have a woods again. And we just got the wood. And I didn't even really think about it. It just came as part of the land where a new cottage is being built and everything else. And then one day I just went up into the woods and I said, oh, I'm back. I'm back. I'm back like that. But it pulls together, I left when I was 11 from the farm. So that was the last time. And, now I'm 81. But I think it's a connection that there's meaning that you had a long time ago. That meaning is still in the present. And I think it has to do, my sense is that humans at their best are meaning-making creatures. And, that's why the whole thing that we're information processors, that the tech people talk about, Ray Kurzweil, well, human beings are just information processors.
It's not true.
No, we're meaning makers. We actually don't really care whether the information is true or not true or accurate or not accurate. We don't really care. Is it useful for putting together meaning?
I think, it's not that people don't care. I think they don't know. I don't think they know how they change their own narratives.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be very, very aware in order to do that, which most people aren't.
You know who really got this down pat is defense lawyers. They really know what people do with their memories. No, a really good defense lawyer can get you to change your memory with about 5 questions.
You mean a prosecutor or
No, a defense lawyer, no, it's the witness on the prosecution side. And he says, well, it happened this way, and I did it. And say, wait a minute, and they'll ask 5 questions, and all of a sudden they're not so sure that they saw what they saw or heard what they heard.
Yeah, then the memory becomes a blur.
Yeah, and then the prosecutor, a good prosecutor, probably does it too, It's part of the legal skill.
Well, yeah, and discrediting the witness.
Yeah.
That you can't count on their memory. What they thought was so certain, in fact, isn't. Yeah. I just demonstrated that.
Yeah.
But, yeah, there was a dead-end street in our neighborhood that bordered woods, and not big woods, but woods. And there was a pond, not fit for swimming, but you go down there with a mason jar, and you could fill the mason jar with water, and you'd get a bunch of tadpoles. And I don't know who built it, but there was a kind of a rough raft, and this was not a big pond, maybe 20 feet across, 30 feet across at the most. I have no idea how deep it ultimately was. Nobody ever swam in it. But it was this mysterious gathering place for us kids.
Sure. Yeah. And your brain did all sorts of things with that pond when you were down there.
That's right. That's right. And so, when you think of those things, and I think about stuff that I like, whether it's actual physical record albums, which I like, actual pictures you can hold as opposed to look at it on my phone. I like physical objects. And, and I think about where memory comes in and how do we try to preserve memory? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think that's a fascinating area to me because this is where I think memories become the product. Snapshots, home movies, diaries, journals, all of these things that are the manifestation. And we write down, of course, if you ever kept a diary, if you ever kept a journal, we remember what we want to remember from those things. And sometimes things can be really vivid. And I saved lots of my old writings, and there are times that I have zero memory of what the origin of that was. But for the most part, it's pretty well seated. Mm-hmm. And to me, reading has always been an important and enjoyable activity. And so the things that I wrote that I liked, I tried to preserve. But the home movies, all of those things, I think are the byproducts of memory. Do we need them? No. But do they enhance the possibility that you'll remember things, whether accurately or not?
Mhm.
You know, I think it's really interesting because also memory is associative. So when you, all of a sudden, if you see somebody, you're going to remember other people that you hadn't thought about for years.
Mhm.
And so it gets back to, again, then what is it that makes something memorable? Why do we want to preserve memories?
Well, who you think you are is very tied up with your memories. Things that are still meaningful decades later has a certain solidity to it. It has a certain foundational solidity to it. And I think that it depends upon your awareness at the time. Like I think about your movie theater in the basement of your house. That was a very formative experience, given what you're doing today. Yeah. Yeah, you were putting butts in seats back then, and your whole goal is to put butts in seats today.
True.
But the other
True.
thing is that you were taking an ordinary basement and you were turning it into a special place. And you didn't stop there. You put up posters, you had popcorn, yeah, you had everything. You kind of imposed an imaginary reality on an actual place and got away with it. I mean, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, it was fun. But, when you just used a phrase that most often is used pejoratively. Who do you think you are?
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah. Well, I know, but do you?
Yeah. Yeah, I know who I am.
I know who are. Do you know who you are?
That answer would really disturb some of my teachers.
Yeah.
When I came back at them with, who do you think you are? And I said, well, I know who I am. And
I'm not you.
yes,
And there's no chance.
many years later, after the first time I was disciplined at the school, because my teachers either really liked me and I got along great with them, or they didn't like me at all.
Yeah. No middle ground.
I learned the belief that, which was fine with me. My belief was that you're not going to get along with everybody. I don't deliberately antagonize anybody or anything, but, I look at it. It was funny. One of the fathers at the school, there was the graduation party for the kids. And there was a party at this place. This is when our kids were graduating from high school. And, I was spending all the time with the kids because they were friends of my kids. And I was wondering, so, wow, you got a next big step. This is a milestone coming up, your high school graduation. You're going on to college. Most of these kids were going on to college. What does that mean to you? What are you excited about? What are you looking forward to? All of that kind of thing. And I was talking to them, and one of the fathers came up to me and said, why don't you come up with us and have a drink? I said, I find them more interesting. And he said, yeah, but you've been down here all evening with the kids. Why don't you come up and talk to us? And I said, because I know your story. They're setting off on a whole new adventure. I want to hear how they feel about it. I think that's interesting and exciting, and I like that. He said, Jeff, you're an interesting guy, but, I think that if you didn't put yourself out there so strongly and people got a sense to know you a little bit more, I think that, you could get in with some of these people in a way that
you could go up in the world, Jeff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm actually doing this out of respect for them. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I'd rather find out right away that we don't get along so I don't waste any time in this relationship and then move on. Yeah. And it's always been the case. And the thing that's so wonderful is...
No, the thing that they were missing where they was talking. They were just drinking.
Yes, and small talk.
Yeah, well, whatever.
Yes.
Yeah. Wish Jeff was here.
I mean, it's funny. So I was going to say what triggered that, the who do you think you are, jump ahead 40 years from that first experience. my daughter is in like 5th grade, and the teacher said no talking in class. And so Audrey asked the girl across from her, what page did she say to go to? And the teacher stands up and takes Audrey and her friend out of the classroom. And she said, I said no talking. And Audrey said, I didn't hear what page you said to go to. And the teacher said, I said, no talking, you're disrupting the class. And then you could hear the class in the hallway, you could hear them inside the classroom. And Audrey said to her, and she was like in 5th grade, and she said, don't you think it's more disruptive that you're out here with us 2 people and you've got 20 kids in that room making all that noise? Isn't that more disruptive than what we did? And then the teacher said, I want you to go back in that classroom and I want you to keep your mouth shut. And so I was told by, this teacher reported her to the principal and this other girl, and they said that, Audrey was talking. And then she, had talked back to the teacher. What do you think of that? And I said, she's right. It was much more disruptive. Yeah. The teachers were out in the hallway. The teacher didn't gauge the effect of her action. And I can't disagree with my daughter. She was correct. It was more disruptive that the teacher was out in the hallway leaving the class unsupervised. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, that's my daughter. It was just kind of interesting to me.
Yeah. I want to get back to the Finding Gilmore book from the 1990s. My sense is that they were just, at that point, they were just about 10 years into the sort of the technological revolution, and the internet was now available when their book came out.
Right.
And my sense is, because in the book we're writing, the conclusion of the book is that theater is theater, having your entrepreneurial company base itself on theater principles is actually a very crucial and necessary strategy to compete in a world that is pervasively more technological.
Absolutely, yes.
And my sense is that whatever they were writing in the 1990s, it's doubly and triply so. The whole point of making sure that your business actually represents a very fundamental and meaningful experience to the people who are your customers.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Because as we are more technologically connected, we are more as individuals isolated. The result is also the latest reading scores have come out. They're the lowest in modern history.
Math scores, too.
And critical thinking isn't even taught, which I think is absolutely essential.
Yeah, I was noticing Harvard this week announced that they're going to do remedial math for all their freshman students.
Is that true?
Yeah. Well, they passed a math test to get into Harvard. What are they doing remedial math for? Yeah.
And so I think that that's symptomatic of a number of things. I think there are kids who are graduating high school in those last 2 years, COVID decimated their education. Not to mention that, I think there's also just issues with how things are taught and all of that. But I think that because we're so isolated emotionally, people feel so detached and removed from social interaction. I don't think we have yet realized the dangers that go along with, and I'm talking about psychological dangers, that go along with, for instance, remote work. Social skills. I mean, it seems to me that civility is not a part of our day-to-day activity. It ought to be, I believe. And I think that part of that reason is the more isolated you are and the more anonymous you are on social media, where you can be rude, insulting, mean, all those kinds of things on social media, and how that affects kids. I think that all of these things together create a much greater sense of isolation and anger and disassociation. And I think that going to work is a social experience. Being with your colleagues is a social experience. We learn from those things.
Being in teams is a social experience.
That's right. Yeah. And so how do you feel about that in terms of remote work, yeah, you can say, oh, I'm just as productive at home. I'm even more productive at home. But now my argument is, well, actually, you're not, because there's a part of your social self that is not being exercised as a result. And I think that that's dangerous.
My own experience of it has been very, very different because I don't feel, for example, the ability to do podcasting went through the roof when COVID started. That I could do. I mean, if we didn't have Zoom, we wouldn't be doing a podcast series. There's a whole new structure and process that entered into our lives when we could do Zoom. And I feel totally connected, to you where you are. But I've always been sort of connected, from childhood. I always took part in gangs and teams, and, I always enjoyed teamwork, even on the farm, because I think the reason why we moved off the farm when I was 11 years old, that my parents realized that none of us wanted to continue with the farm. But I enjoyed the teamwork, from an early age. You had your chores and you had to do your chores. And, everybody had chores of one kind or another in the family. And, you did them in school. I always took part in school activities, and, I always played sports of one kind or another, and I was useful. I won't say I was a great team member, but I was a good team member. I've always been a good team member like that. And, and the other thing is I had at a very early age, direct connection. I could talk to people much older than me, and I could ask them questions about their experience. So I don't feel particularly, what should I say, impacted by technology.
But I think there's a reason for that. And the reason is you and I did not grow up with social media. You went out to play with other kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
You weren't sitting in front of a computer screen.
Yeah.
There are those schools that are enacting rules that you can't have your cell phone in the class.
Yeah.
When I was teaching at Parsons, I had students turn off their cell phones and put them away. I didn't want to see their cell phones.
Yeah.
I wanted them to be present in the classroom. I am hardly what you would call a disciplinarian, but we're there to focus and do some work and learn from each other, not stare at your phone. Yeah. And so we didn't grow up.
I have that with the entrepreneurs too. I mean, I'm 30, 40 years older than some of them now, and I'll notice that it's gone beyond reason in the workshop room. And I say, okay, now everybody, I want you to mimic paying attention to me. I said, I don't care if you are paying attention, but from the way you look at it, it looks like you're paying attention to me. So, but can I tell you, just to break the thing, do you know how you get everybody's attention? You tell them a story.
Yeah, well, yeah.
The moment you tell somebody a story, everything stops and they listen to the story. All you're saying is they're looking for something that's interesting, and it's either on the phone or it's what's happening in person. The reason is that the ability to communicate in an interesting way has been lost. I think it's been lost. I listen, when I'm at other people's houses, and I listen to how the children are talking, and they're trading mumbles. One mumbles something, the other one mumbles, but there's no story structure. There's no interesting information actually being transcribed. I think the thing that struck me most, in London where we stay, there's a Japanese restaurant across from the hotel, and we were in there, and there were 8 teenage Japanese, I think they were Japanese restaurant, so high probability they were Japanese, 15, 16, and all 8 of them were looking at their cell phone. During the entire meal, they were looking at their cell phone. Now, the only question I have, were they connecting with each other by their cell phone rather than looking to another person? But they weren't talking to each other. And I said, I think they're being disenabled from their future by having this habit of just looking at their cell phone. What it tells me, they don't have the skill just to interact at a table.
Well, they also have, we all at this point know about the dopamine hit that happens when you get a ping on your phone. Yeah. And, all of the things that are this immediate, I think, destructive feedback, because most of those things, if you got it now or you had that period of the day where, okay, you can use your cell phone from 4 to 6 o'clock, whatever the hell it is. I think that would be different, but I think everyone is searching, and I'm talking about younger kids because that's who's going to be taken over.
Yep.
And I think that the social skills we're talking about, it's not about mastering Zoom. I think Zoom is great, and it was a lifesaver for me during COVID and lockdown.
Me too.
But again, we didn't grow up with our fundamental means of communication, texting and sending pictures to phones, and so we're not going to be so effective. We'll use the tool for different reasons that serve our business purposes or even social, with getting together with friends via Zoom, whether it's COVID or not. But I think that I think about how I feel when I hear a Beatles song, or hear something classic rock from that era or whatever. And I've often thought about, what are these kids going to be nostalgic for? What are they going to attach? Is it, if you're spending all that time staring into computer screens, what is it that you're going to think about when you look back on your life? What unique experiences, which most unique experiences, you're out in the world doing something, not at a screen.
It was very interesting. I think it was about 10 years ago. It was just something that was in the Wall Street Journal, and it would talk about the highest grossing tours, live music tours, and the groups that were doing it. And without any exception, the groups that were doing it were in their 60s and 70s.
Right. Yeah.
They were 60s and 70s, top grossing, The Who and Led Zeppelin, like
Paul McCartney.
And Rolling Stones,
Bruce Springsteen.
Bruce Springsteen. The performers were all in their 60s and 70s. And I think the reason for that, if you trace it back over the decades, you get to about the mid-70s, and there was still such a thing as a national audience, and right up until about 1975, where, when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, their first appearance in the United States was on the Ed Sullivan Show. Everybody had that experience. It was like Elvis Presley, when Elvis Presley was on Ed Sullivan Show. Everybody had that experience. The grandmothers had that experience. 6 and 7-year-olds had that experience, okay? But things got fragmented. Technology got fragmented starting in the 1970s and 75, so that there's genre after genre. You have your genre, other people have their genres. I think it's the lack of common experience that interferes with people's ability to communicate. If you can't basically what communication means is finding common ground. And I think that even though they're using the medium, they're all using the medium, the messages are all different that they're getting on the medium. They're all getting different messages. Like I was watching, I've never been on TikTok, but something threw me into a TikTok. I was tracking down something, and I think it must have been a subject, and the search engine put me into a roll of TikTok, and they were 30 seconds to 60 seconds. There was one, and then there was a totally different one, and then there's a totally different one. There was no theme to it whatsoever. The only thing that held it together is that it was the medium that held it together. And I guess that's what Marshall McLuhan meant when he said the medium is the message. Yeah. But it's not nourishing, it's not very nourishing, because your brain has to turn channels every minute. There's no continuity to the message, and it puts you into a passive state. It puts you into a very passive state, and you just run out of energy to respond after a while.
Well, I think that what also happens is, you don't have to respond. If you're doing, what they call doom scrolling on your phone, and you're just going like that on all the Instagram feeds and everything else, that's not interaction.
No.
Liking something doesn't mean liking like we know what liking is. You don't friend somebody, and
probably the dopamine.
Well, yeah.
No, I mean, there's another way of handling, never be on it at all. That's another way of handling the whole experience, is just don't have the experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't know how to get on social media. I've never been on social media. I haven't been on Facebook. I haven't been on any Instagram. I've never been on it because it just seemed to me that there was no value to it. You know,
Well, I actually have never put anything personal on social media. I did use it for my company, which in my case, because I never had a social media manager. I was creating lots of content for social media especially for Victoria's Secret, but I had never had any interest in sharing my life on Facebook or Instagram or anything.
no,
And never did.
yeah.
But, I think, yeah, you're right. You could go off it altogether.
I mean, that's the way I've just, but probably your point about the two of us were born at a different age. We had developed our own way. I'm a big reader, right? From the moment I could read, I'm a big reader. I am more of a reader at 80 than I was at 70 because I stopped watching television, altogether. And, I got about 800 hours a year back, and, I'm reading an enormous amount these days. But, and I grew up on radio too. So even when television came, I was still attached to radio. So it was probably a generational opportunity not to get hooked on these things.
Well, I also think that how you use something, using AI as a tool.
Yeah.
As opposed to speculating. I think that it's important to speculate what the impact of something is going to be. I mean, the train has left the station, as they say, in terms of social media, because nobody was asking the right questions or any questions at all when it first started. So I think looking at potential consequences and ramifications are important.
Yeah.
The impact negatively has been substantial.
Do you think there's any way of doing that? Knowing what the consequences of something new is going to be.
Well, I think that if it's possible, you only discover that through discussion, not through just leaving it alone.
Yeah.
And hoping
because the European Union has a thing called the precautionary principle. If something new today can harm somebody in the future, we don't do it today. And I said, boy, that sure cuts off a lot of the future.
Yeah, I don't know that it's exactly like that, so cut and dried, but I do think that they have done some smarter things in terms of social media and kids, but it's not a total shutoff valve. But I think that I mean, it's like so many things. Most times people don't respond to things until it impacts them.
Yeah.
And at this point, though, with things like that, it's impacting hundreds of millions of people globally. There's impact to it that we could have never anticipated, certainly without having conversations about how could this be used. That kind of speculation is done about so many other things. And I think it's something that so messes with our minds. It would have been great if there were smart people trying to determine both the good and the bad, and how do you make it more good than bad.
Maybe what we were lacking during this period was really interesting adults. And the children had no choice. The adults were so boring that they had to go to something else. I had interesting adults when I was growing up.
Well, you also had the opportunity to discover that.
Yeah.
Which is a whole other thing. I mean, I don't think we yet know the consequences of kids that were just beginning to get data on, these kids that spent formative years online, social media, and so on, increasing suicide rates. There's so many problems that have arisen. And, anything you take in regularly, whether it's social media or tobacco products or food, whatever, there's at least some discussion about it. And this just kind of exploded. And I think everyone was unaware. And I guess because it was so uniquely new, who could have known? But we do know now. So there's no excuse not to try to understand, what's going on. When television started, there were two phrases that came out at essentially the same time. One was, television is the window on the world.
Mhm.
The other was television is the vast wasteland.
Who was that coined that?
Newton Miniman.
Yeah. Yeah.
And both are true.
Yeah.
Both are true. Both things can be true at the same time.
Mhm.
And, I guess my bent is I would rather have things tilt more towards the positive and beneficial.
Mhm.
And I'm not trusting enough of the general populace to just leave it up to chance.
Yeah. Well, who would control it?
Yeah. Well, that's right.
I mean, most of the people who would like to control something, I have worries about that. I mean, my own experience, because we're hiring, we hire a lot in their 20s. So these are people who have been through, we have a rule you can't do social media during work time. You can do it at a break if you have a break or something like that. But our work is interesting. Our teamwork is interesting. And it'll be more so as the 4x4, gets into play. And, I'm going to talk about that, how we're progressing with that in one of the last chapters of the book. It's actually a working model of people using it and everything. But, I've got a lot of clients now who are showing up in their 20s because technology is enabling really young people to make a lot of money at a very early age. I mean, they have to make 200,000 to qualify for our first level. So there's a lot of people. They're bright, they're interesting, but I think our program attracts a certain thoughtfulness, that there are people who thinking about their thinking is they understand that this is really a key skill to being an entrepreneur. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think to be an engaged human,
Yeah.
I think it's an essential
Yeah.
skill.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we don't know what life was like in the old days. Because the chroniclers of the past decades, past centuries, in that they were reflecting the society that they intermingled with, that they didn't have any contact. I mean, first of all, probably 100 years ago, just an enormous number of people, 1900, 1910, an enormous number of people were just drunk most of the time. No, no, I mean, they were drinking alcohol that not only made them drunk, they were drinking alcohol. There were no standards or regulations on alcohol, The children who looked, like very, very dull were probably cocaine to a lot of the pacifiers the children were taking just made them, how do you quiet down a rambunctious child? You give him Coca-Cola, which had Coke in it. That's where the coca comes from, the cola. The thing is that there's a big population. The population is so much bigger right now. When I was born, there were 2.2 million. This is 1944. The world population was 2.2 million. Now it's
not 2.2 million, 2 billion.
2.2 billion, yeah, 2.2 billion. Now it's upwards of 9 billion. And, that's 4 times change in an 80-year period. That's a big thing. So I think one thing, there's just a lot of people around today, and it's hard to get a handle on whether they're, better or worse than people at a similar age in a frequent time, I mean, a lot of the people you graduated from in Akron, yours did because you were, you selected a particularly bright group of people, ambitious, talented, successful, but probably the vast majority. I mean, I went home for a reunion 25 years after I graduated from high school, and they were already talking about retiring. I got back and they said, somebody asked me, how was it? And I said, there's a reason I haven't seen them in 25 years. First of all, there's a lot of sensationalism in the reporting. Maybe there's just a lot of good kids out, but they don't get the attention of the reporters who want to make a case.
Yeah, well, I think in the things we're talking about, the people making the case are oftentimes psychologists, people involved in human development, people who are trying to understand, what's going on. And
they're also trying to get money to solve the problem.
Probably some are.
Yeah. I think a lot of them are.
But I also think there are well-intentioned, intelligent people who are trying to make people aware of what's happening. And then it's a question of, who do you listen to and how do you vet the information and all of that kind of thing. But I think that a horrifying example to me is, the kid that shot the healthcare CEO.
Yeah. Mangione.
Yeah. That I think it was in less than a day because he was a good looking kid, or he is a good looking kid. He was getting proposals of marriage. There were all this, and
his GoFundMe is up to 350,000. I was reading the other day, and but
I mean, there has always been that. It just spreads a lot faster now.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I look at that and think, wow, you're trying to make a folk hero out of somebody that killed somebody else.
Well, they did that with bank robbers in the 1930s.
Well, yeah. I mean, Jesse James was a hero to people. Billy the Kid was a hero. I understand that.
Yeah. John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly.
Yeah.
The Parker Gang, Ma Parker.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we've always deified outlaws of a certain kind.
Yeah, well, there's also, we suspect that there's villains in society that, deserve to be shot. I mean, that if you have Robin Hood, you got the Sheriff of Nottingham,
right.
No,
I don't think that basic human nature has changed, since societies became organized.
Yep.
I mean, I think you look at ancient Greece and there's a lot of parallels to what's going on now. Mm-hmm. I always wondered, when they say in 200 BC, and I'm thinking, how'd they know it was BC? Mm-hmm. That always flummoxed to me. How did they know it was BC? Mm-hmm. But I think that when you're talking about human nature, I think that's essentially unchanged. It's just our way to tap into it, the way it's manifest.
I think what people have to deal with changes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't know that their responses change.
Yeah. I think the big thing, and a lot of Joe Polish has a lot of insight to this, that the whole thing about dopamine and, that we have drugs inside of us. We don't realize it, that like everything that you can experience as a drug from the outside, we already have that experience on the inside. And Joe has gone through a lot of negative experiences, which he's very forthright about. But I think that there's an ability to get addicted to substances, to experiences today that overwhelm your brain's ability to think about it in a rational way. And I think it happens at a very young age. I think most addictions in life probably happen around 14 or 15 years old. The human brain has not fully developed until age 24. They're pretty clear about that. Your actual thinking ability, rational thinking, critical thinking, you don't have it at 14 or 15 years old.
Yeah, and I think that addiction is its own issue. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that treating it as a disease, which is how it's being looked at, mm-hmm. as opposed to a human failing.
As a crime.
Yeah. Now, it can cause criminal behavior if you're trying to feed addiction.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a whole other kind of a topic. Yeah. But I just think that the problems we deal with as people are evergreen, whether it's addictive behaviors, violent behaviors, things that are the birth of altruistic movements. I mean, all kinds of things. I just don't know that changes. But I think what technology has enabled to happen is getting the word out and congregating people in a much, much faster way than ever before.
Well, I think that what we're working on here, what you work on, period, with the movement upward of the play personality into, the major leagues of all theaters, and what the book we're writing, Casting Not Hiring, I think what we're doing is bringing back a great deal of human connection back to the workplace. I think that's what we're doing here. I'm very, very aware of it because we have a fairly large team at the company, 120. It's not a small company, it's a medium-sized company. And I deal with hundreds of entrepreneurs who themselves have teams and everything else. And my sense is that we're taking a very positive, very productive approach to how you get people to engage with each other in, an arena that uses up the majority of their daily time for most of the days of the year. And I think we're doing a real service with what we're doing. And they're going to have some kind of experience. Why don't we give them an experience that's really a healthy and positive and creative experience?
I completely agree with you. And that is the goal, to help people know how to engage that can create more fulfilling, gratifying, profitable business growth situation.
Yeah.
And again, that means engaging with others. So how do you do that in the most effective way possible?
Yeah. Dr. Samuel Johnson, who wrote one of the first dictionaries in the English language in the 1600s, early 1700s, he says, I can think of no activity more harmless than the making of money.
Well, I could certainly question that. There's lots of harm that has...
No, but in terms of what happens in 95% of what happens every day, the activity of making money, the exchange of value for value, is probably prevalent.
Yeah, I think that there's a great deal of the world that functions in a more positive way.
Yep.
And the problem is often is that those negative impacts can be pretty large.
Yep.
But I think that it's important to stay informed and stay engaged and to stay curious and to keep educating yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an area where you and I also bond. Mm-hmm. Is that curiosity, seeking knowledge. We may not agree on everything, but even the disagreements are respectful.
Yeah.
And because it's all in the quest of learning. Mm-hmm. Which I think...
Well, and creating solutions.
Yes, which is what we're doing with the book.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, got on this...
I think we've done well.
Yeah, I think that in the anything and everything category, we were remarkably focused on a couple of topics, which...
Consistence.
It's an accident, but we were...
Yeah. I don't want this to get out of hand of us. All righty.
Thanks for joining us today on our show, Anything and Everything. If you enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. For more about me and my work, visit acreativecareer.com and madoffproductions.com. To learn more about Dan and Strategic Coach, visit strategiccoach.com.